The wind howled through the dense, snow-laden trees. The mountain range loomed like a jagged beast, casting an unforgiving shadow over the wilderness. Blizzards tore across the landscape in wild, unpredictable gusts, turning the world into a frosted blur. In the midst of this bitter cold, hidden away in the heart of the forest, stood an old, weathered cabin. Its single light flickered in the dark, a small beacon of warmth and life amidst the desolation. Inside, a fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room. The air smelled of wood smoke, the scent of age, and the faintest hint of pine. In the corner by the hearth, a woman sat Helen, her long grey hair framing a face that had seen the passage of many years, many storms, and much loss. Helen had lived alone here for over a decade now, the isolation a quiet companion that she had come to accept. She had been a teacher in her younger years, a mother, a wife, but that all felt like a lifetime ago. Her husband had passed unexpectedly, and with him, her connection to the world beyond the mountains had slowly dwindled. She had stayed in the cabin not out of obligation, but because it was the only place that felt like home. The world outside was harsh, unrelenting. But it was the one thing she knew, the only thing that had remained constant. She had learned to survive in the wilderness, to live with the wind and the snow, to be as resilient as the land itself. But tonight was different. The storm was stronger, fiercer. The wind seemed to scream in a way that unsettled Helen, carrying with it something unfamiliar, something unnatural. Helen sat by the fire, knitting a thick woolen blanket, the quiet rhythm of her hands calming her restless thoughts. The storm outside grew louder, the wind rattling the windows like a wild animal seeking entry. A faint, eerie noise drifted through the howling wind, something soft yet distinct, like a whimper. Helen's heart skipped. Her breath caught in her throat. She rose to her feet slowly, her frail bones creaking with the effort. She stepped toward the door, the howling wind growing louder, as though it were pressing against the very fabric of her cabin. Another sound, a soft whine, followed by the sound of paws dragging through the snow. Her instincts flared something or someone was out there. She pulled her thick coat around her shoulders, grabbed her lantern and opened the door. The blizzard rushed in like a tidal wave, biting at her skin and stinging her eyes. But she stepped, out squinting into the storm. There, near the edge of the forest, a figure lay on the snow, a large dog, its body trembling violently, fur matted with blood and snow. The dog's eyes were dull, filled with pain, but there was something in them, something almost human. Helen's heart ached. "Come here, boy," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold. But the dog didn't move. It whimpered softly, barely, able to lift its head. Without hesitation, Helen dropped to her knees beside the animal, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch the dog's fur. She could feel the warmth of its body, though it was fading rapidly. Her breath hitched. She could feel the weight of its suffering in a way that struck her deeply. It reminded her of her own pain, the quiet grief that had settled in her heart ever since her husband's death. But unlike her, this creature had no voice to mourn with, no solace to find. "Don't worry," Helen murmured, her hands gently brushing the snow from the dog's fur. "I won't leave you here." Helen carried the dog inside the cabin, her old body straining against the weight of the animal. She set it down near the fire, wrapping it in blankets. The dog shivered uncontrollably, its breathing shallow and labored. She worked quickly, her hands moving with surprising steadiness as she checked for injuries, tending to the worst of the wounds, cleaning the blood and snow from its fur. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, the wind howling as the snow piled. Up higher against the windows. Helen didn't sleep, only paused briefly to sip from her mug of tea, all while keeping a watchful eye on the dog. She had to keep it alive. She had to. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the storm, the dog's breathing had steadied, though it was still weak. Its golden eyes opened slowly, meeting Helen's gaze. It didn't growl or recoil. Instead, it watched her, calculating as if it knew her every thought, her every sorrow. Helen hesitated, her hand hovering over the dog's head. The air seemed to crackle with an energy that she couldn't quite explain. Something strange, something otherworldly. "You're going to be okay," she said softly, her voice filled with conviction. "You're not alone anymore." The dog let out a low, almost inaudible sound, and Helen was certain it understood her. Days passed, and Helen cared for the dog like it was her own flesh and blood. Despite the initial uncertainty, the dog began to recover at an astonishing rate. Its once dull eyes grew bright again. Its coat began to shine as though it were healed by some invisible hand. But more than that, the dog began to act strangely, almost unnervingly so. One evening, just as the wind began to pick up again, the dog stood suddenly, ears perked, eyes darting to the door. Helen looked up in surprise. "What is it, boy?" she asked, her voice tinged with confusion. Without warning, the dog bolted toward the door, its muscles rippling with strength. Helen rushed to follow, her heart pounding. She reached the door just as the first flakes of snow began to fall. The wind had shifted, another blizzard was coming, and the dog seemed to know it before Helen did. The storm hit with a ferocity that was almost unnatural. But the dog standing beside her didn't flinch. Instead, it turned to her, its eyes meeting hers with an almost knowing look. "Stay inside," Helen said, her voice trembling. "It's not safe." But the dog didn't move. It stood, a silent sentinel against the storm, its gaze never leaving her. Helen had not been expecting company. It had been years since anyone had visited her cabin in the woods. But when a knock came at the door one afternoon, it startled her more than it should have. Opening the door, she found a tall man standing in the doorway, his face weathered by time, but his eyes sharp, piercing. He was dressed in the rugged gear of someone accustomed to harsh conditions. "I'm looking for a dog," he said, his voice low but urgent. "A German shepherd with golden eyes. Have you seen one?" Helen's heart skipped. She glanced over at the dog, who was now sitting by the hearth, watching the stranger intently. The man's gaze followed her, and he nodded slowly, his expression hardening. "That dog. It was part of a specialized rescue unit, trained for high-risk operations. It was taken from us during a mission, and we've been looking for it ever since." Helen stood in the doorway, her hand still clutching the doorframe as the wind howled behind her. The stranger's eyes didn't leave. The dog, which now stood at attention, its body tense as if it had already recognized him. "Who are you?" Helen asked, her voice tinged with suspicion, but also a deep sense of curiosity. The man sighed, his breath coming out in white puffs. "My name is Jack. I was part of a specialized unit, trained for search and rescue operations. This dog," he pointed to the German shepherd, whose golden eyes gleamed like fire in the dim light of the cabin, "was one of the best. He saved countless lives." Helen looked at the dog, a lump forming in her throat. It had been such an odd presence since it had arrived, showing signs of intelligence and understanding that went far beyond what she had expected from an ordinary dog. But the revelation that this animal had once been part of a rescue team, a trained search and rescue dog, made her stomach twist. She couldn't deny the feeling that there was something almost mystical about it. "Why was he abandoned?" Helen asked softly, her heart aching for the dog. It had been near death when she had found it, lying alone in the snow. She had nursed it back to health, and it had responded with a bond that felt deep, profound, almost like it had been waiting for her. Jack's expression hardened. "It's a long story. We were on a mission in the mountains when an avalanche struck. The dog, his team was lost. We thought he was gone too, but then somehow we couldn't find him. I've been searching ever since. He's trained to work with humans, and he's not just a dog, Helen. He's part wolf." Helen's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the wolf. The dog's piercing eyes seemed to glow even brighter in the firelight. She had suspected something different about him, but hearing this made her feel even more conflicted. "Part wolf?" she repeated softly. Jack nodded. "Yes. The unit worked with wolves hybrids, to be precise. They're smarter, faster, and more instinctive than a regular dog. They're trained to operate in the harshest conditions, save lives in the most dangerous places. He was a part of that unit, and now he's lost. But I can't let him stay here, Helen. I need to take him back. He belongs with us." Helen's chest tightened at the thought of losing the dog. This remarkable, almost otherworldly creature who had come into her life at a time when she needed someone to cling to. She could feel the weight of the decision in the pit of her stomach. The storm outside was nothing compared to the turmoil she felt inside. The dog turned its head slowly toward her, its golden eyes locking with hers. She saw the connection they shared, deep and undeniable, but she also saw something else, a quiet plea. Helen stepped away from the door, gesturing for Jack to enter. "Come inside," she said, her voice low. "You can explain more over tea." Inside, the fire crackled, casting warm light over the cabin's humble interior. Jack sat across from Helen at the small wooden table, the dog lying quietly by the hearth. The air between them was thick with tension. "I don't understand," Helen said, breaking the silence. "If he's a part of your unit, why would he be out there alone? Why didn't anyone find him sooner?" Jack's expression softened, and he rubbed his face with his hands. "We were close. The storm hit, and we lost communication. I should have been there to help him. He's more than just a dog. He's part of me, part of the team. But when I went back, I couldn't find him. He was gone until now." Helen stared at the dog, its golden eyes watching her intently. She had no doubt that Jack was telling the truth, that this dog had a past, one that tied him to something far greater than her quiet, solitary life. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the bond they had formed. The dog had saved her in a way too. It had pulled her out of her own grief, filling a space she didn't even realize had been empty. It was more than just an animal, it was something that had helped her heal. "I can't let him go," Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not after everything he's been through. He's not just some dog to me. He's been part of my life now too." Jack's face was hard, but his eyes softened for a moment. "I know you've grown attached, but you need to understand, Helen. He has a calling, a purpose. He's meant to help people, to save lives. And as much as I can see the bond between you two, you know as well as I do that it's not right to keep him here. He's not meant for this life." Helen's eyes filled with tears and she turned away, looking toward the window where the snow had begun to fall again. The wind howled, almost as if it were echoing her internal struggle. "I've lost so much," she whispered. "I can't lose him too." Jack stood up, walking over to the dog. He knelt down beside it, and for a moment, they simply shared an unspoken connection, man, dog, and the wild unknown that hovered between them. "I understand," Jack said softly, "but you'll have to make the decision soon. I can't stay forever." Helen woke early the next morning, the storm still raging outside. She walked to the hearth, the fire crackling low in the quiet of the cabin. The dog lay by the fire, its golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. For a moment, Helen simply stood there, her heart aching. She had spent so many years alone, her world reduced to the vast wilderness outside and the small, warm cabin inside. This dog had changed that in a way she couldn't explain. It was more than companionship. It was a healing force she hadn't known she needed, but she also knew Jack was right. The dog had a purpose, a higher calling that would take it far from this place. As much as it hurt, she understood that it was time to let go. She bent down, gently stroking the dog's head. "You have to go, don't you?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The dog looked up at her, its gaze steady and understanding. It gave a soft whine, almost as if acknowledging her words. "Go on." "Then," Helen said, tears slipping down her cheeks, "be the hero you were meant to be." Jack was waiting outside, his vehicle parked near the edge of the woods. The dog followed him without a backward glance, and for a brief moment, Helen saw the faintest flash of something in the dog's eyes. Something that told her this was not goodbye forever. Weeks passed. The storm had subsided, and the wilderness outside was blanketed in snow. Helen spent her days tending to the cabin, her thoughts often wandering to the dog she had let go. She missed him terribly. But deep down, she knew it had been the right choice. Then one morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, a letter arrived. It was from Jack. Inside there was a photo, a picture of the dog, standing proudly next to a group of rescue workers, its golden eyes burning bright with determination. The letter read, "Helen, I wanted you to know that the dog has done incredible things since we found him. He's saved lives, helped countless people. His instinct, his courage, he's truly one of a kind. He hasn't forgotten you, we haven't forgotten you. Thank you for giving him the chance to fulfill his purpose. As a token of appreciation, we're sending you something that might remind you of him, something that carries a bit of his spirit." Helen opened a small box inside of which was a puppy, small, golden and bright-eyed, with the same fierce gaze as the dog she had loved. It was a sign, a new beginning, a second chance. The puppy in Helen's arms was small, but there was a familiarity about it that struck her to her core. It had the same golden eyes as the dog she had sent away, the same fierce intelligence that had captured her heart. She stroked its soft fur, her fingers trembling with both sorrow and joy. She couldn't believe it. She had never expected this little creature that had been sent to her as a reminder of the bond she had shared with the dog, of the life she had let go. The snow had stopped falling, and the air had grown still. The world outside seemed to hold its breath as though waiting for something to happen. And maybe it was. Helen stood up and moved toward the window, the puppy nestled in her arms. She looked out at the vast white wilderness stretching before her. The cabin had once been a place of isolation and solitude, but now, with the warmth of the small animal in her arms, it felt different, alive, full of potential. A soft whine came from the puppy, and she looked down to see it looking up at her with the same golden eyes. It licked her hand and she smiled, her heart swelling with a strange mixture of hope and sadness. The wind had picked up again, but this time it felt different. It didn't feel like a storm to be feared, but a wind carrying something new, something unspoken yet powerful. Days passed and the little puppy grew just as the dog had once done. Helen fed it, cared for it, and watched as it began to show signs of intelligence beyond its age. It would sit patiently by the door when it sensed a storm coming, much like the dog before it. At night, it would curl up next to her, its warmth, a comfort that filled the empty spaces of the cabin. But the bond Helen shared with the puppy wasn't quite the same. There were differences, subtle yet significant. The puppy had not known the same sorrow, the same hardships that had made her bond with the original dog so deep. But there was something more, something Helen couldn't quite explain. One evening, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Helen sat by the window. The puppy nestled at her feet. The storm outside had begun to pick up again, the wind howling through the trees as snow swirled through the air. She thought of the dog that had come into her life like a force of nature, a creature so much more than what it seemed. She thought of the way it had stood by her, how it had saved her life in a way she could never repay. And now she thought of this small puppy, the symbol of renewal, of second chances. The door creaked open suddenly, and Helen looked up, startled. The wind howled again, but there was no one in the doorway, except for the shadow. It was him. The dog. Helen gasped, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the familiar form step slowly into the cabin, its fur now thick and glossy, its eyes still glowing with that same golden fire. It moved silently, almost impossibly, as though it had been a part of her all along. The puppy barked excitedly and ran to meet him, its tiny paws skidding across the floor. The dog lowered its head, and for a moment they shared a quiet, unspoken exchange, a moment of recognition. Helen's eyes welled with tears as she stood up, trembling. The dog she had sent away, had come back. Not to stay, she knew that. But for a moment it had returned, as if to say goodbye in its own way. "I knew you'd be back," Helen whispered, her voice filled with both sorrow and love. The dog turned toward her, its eyes locking onto hers. There was a depth of understanding in that gaze, a silent message that told her everything she needed to know. It wasn't truly gone. It was a part of her, always. The wind shifted again, a gust that seemed to carry with it the scent of the wild. The dog turned away, heading back toward the door, its body moving with a grace and strength that reminded Helen of everything it had once been. As the door closed behind him, she felt the finality of it. The dog had left, not as a loss, but as a continuation of something much bigger, something beyond what she could comprehend. Helen sat by the window, looking out at the snowy expanse once again. The puppy was at her feet, now asleep, its small chest rising and falling with each breath. The world outside was still and silent, as though holding its breath. She thought of the dog, and of the days it had spent with her. The days it had taught her the meaning of resilience, of love, and of letting go. She had given it a second chance, and in return it had given her a new beginning. Now she had a new companion, one who would grow and learn, and one who would perhaps one day carry on the same spirit that the dog had passed on to her. The puppy stirred in its sleep, and Helen smiled softly. She picked it up gently, cradling it in her arms. It looked up at her with those golden eyes, and for a moment she could see the flicker of the dog, the same spark that had always been there. "You're a special one," Helen whispered, her voice filled with warmth, "just like him." And so in that quiet cabin in the wilderness, surrounded by the endless snow and wind, Helen knew that life would continue, as it always did. The circle of life, of love, and of second chances, just like the dog, like the puppy, would go on, and in that knowledge there was peace.